Ace watched as the doctor tinkered with the TARDIS, occasionally using his umbrella as a third arm, reaching for buttons he couldn't otherwise reach himself. She stuffed her hands into her pockets as she paced around the edges of the control room, her mind fizzing with thoughts and feelings. Professor? Amused came from the Time Lord, but other than that, she knew he wasn't really tuned into listening. Ace let out a sigh as she pushed forward, coming right up towards the console to look her friend deep into his eye. Can you stop? She said, her voice gentle, but concern was growing in her tone. Just for a minute or two? She reached out and grabbed hold of the umbrella. As she took hold of the question mark-shaped handle, it was only then that the doctor finally looked up from his work, a frown beginning to show across his expression. What is it, Ace? He asked. Everything okay? Ace looked at him, trying to read the situation as thoughts built up in her mind. He was impossible to read, even now. Professor, have you ever felt... She paused, pushing the tip of the umbrella into the ground, the sound of the metal colliding with the floor of the TARDIS echoing slightly around them. Have you ever felt like you don't belong, or you weren't welcome somewhere? Not like surrounded by your arch enemies. I know you have plenty, just even around your friends. She had the doctor's attention now. The little Time Lord leaned against the side of the console, crossing his arms across his body. He was giving her his full attention, even if he didn't fully understand what she was saying yet. I don't understand, Ace, he replied. What are you trying to tell me? Ace looked at him, gauging the situation. She gripped the umbrella tight, her knuckles beginning to turn white by her intense grip. For a moment, the doctor glanced down, noticing her tension. Ace, he mused, as his hand reached out towards her, taking the umbrella from her grip. The absence of something to hold hit her like a ton of bricks as she took in a deep breath. You can talk to me, he added, gently now. Back in Perryville, she started, trying to find her words as she pushed down against the side of the console. The old gang, we were all grown up. We were, I suppose, delinquents, but we were still teenagers. Several of them were starting to get crushes and relationships. I suppose that was to be expected. The doctor was quiet. He knew there was a story she needed to tell. She wouldn't have wanted him to interrupt. He just nodded, giving her a cue that she could continue. It never felt like what I wanted, I guess. And at least not in the same way, Ace added. Some people like boys, some like girls, some like neither, or both. She paused, meeting his gaze. Have you ever felt like there's something wrong with you, Professor? Like no one wants to admit they're the same because they're afraid, or that you're the only one like you, or you're broken? The doctor watched her carefully. When she paused for his response, he didn't know what she wanted him to say. He could offer his support, but the social cues were becoming lost to him. Everyone's different, Ace, he said, careful of the way he spoke. But that's not a bad thing. Some are more different than others. But to be able to embrace who you are... He stepped towards her, leaning on the handle of his umbrella. That's what makes you special. He reached out with one hand, gently touching her upper arm. His actions matched with a kind smile across his expression. Ace looked up at him, feeling his gentle touch as somewhat of a comfort. The words escaped her, but she found the strength to give a shy nod. Special was usually something people said just to say, chin up, it'll be okay, but somehow it felt more genuine coming from the doctor, the one she trusted the most roundabout now. She took a deep breath, feeling her way around the console room until she found a chair in the corner, sitting herself down. Can I tell you something? She asked, her voice small. The doctor nodded, as he moved to sit himself beside her. Ace turned slightly, finding a comfortable position, somewhat facing him. I've told you little things about Perryville, haven't I? Just small things. Well, there was something else. A few years back. Dorothy Gale McShane is a troublemaker. Dorothy Gale McShane doesn't make an effort to fit in. Dorothy Gale McShane is an outsider. She was used to the same old comments from the teachers, telling her the same old nonsense about being a good girl. As per usual, she had been sent out from her classroom, her badge-adorned jacket hugging her shoulders as she leaned against the wall outside of the room, letting out deep huffs and puffs, showing how bored she was. It was then that she noticed someone nearby. Hi, she said, raising her voice a little so that the other could be heard down the corridor. Ace realized it was a girl, who looked up and right towards her, just for a moment, before looking back down again. Even from this distance, Ace thought the girl looked sad, down about something. She glared through the glass window of her classroom and slunk down the corridor, approaching the girl. "It's probably none of my business, but are you okay? Is something bothering you?" Her voice was lower, more sensitive now. The girl looked at her, sighed, and sat on the bench nearest to her. Ace knew something was up then, and it was probably really bad. "Hey, do you," she started, "want to talk about it?" The girl looked at her. "I'm Ace, by the way. Well, Dorothy, but I hate that name." "Chantel." Ace smiled. "So, Chantel, is everything okay?" The girl hesitated, letting out a deep and exasperated breath. "I'm sick of being different," she replied. "Everyone expects you to be an individual, but the moment you say you're something unpredictable, suddenly that's not okay." Ace frowned, but lowered her head. Part of her knew that feeling well, though she had never been able to say it, to dare admit it to anyone, even herself. "And well, who cares about school or boys or love?" the girl continued. "It's all bull—" She cut herself off. "Sorry." "No, it's okay," Ace replied, her voice quiet. "I get it. Being what everyone wants is hard work, and I think I know what you might be referring to." Chantel looked at her. The girl was quiet, frowned a little, only letting up when she recognized the same frustration in Ace's expression. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Being called a dyke? A queer?" Absent-mindedly, Ace avoided making eye contact. She felt terrible for not being able to say why she knew exactly what Chantel was feeling. Maybe it was the responses, the name-calling, the prejudice that had prevented her from saying it, that she liked girls. She liked boys, too, but it was the liking girls part that people always seemed to have an issue with. "Maybe—" She kept her head down as she replied. "I know the name-calling, the disgusted stares." Now, as she sat down with Chantel, she found herself full of emotion, not just for the girl, but for herself. What would she want to be said to her, had she actually admitted it? Instead, she just wrapped an arm around the girl, bringing her towards her. "Whoever that was, or is, calling you that, know that they're just hateful, stupid asses," she continued, more certain of herself now. "People are different, and being able to say you are, and to embrace that, that's what makes you special. Sometimes I wish—" She paused, bringing her other arm around to embrace the girl. "I wish someone had told me that." The sound of cruel laughter broke through their hug, and Ace recognized it immediately. She released Chantel, turning to face the boy with a narrowed gaze. "Go off and do one, Midge," she muttered. The boy laughed again. "Why are you hanging around with freaks, Ace?" Chantel glanced between them, recognizing the familiarity. She felt the two gang members' animosity towards one another, and fell silent, cursing herself for not standing up for herself. "She's not a freak, but you are most certainly an asshole," Ace retorted. "Get lost." Midge stared for a few moments, then sucked in his teeth and marched off, but not before sending Ace a particularly nasty death stare. Ace glared back, watching him leave before turning back to Chantel. "I'm sorry. He's always been an ass and a bully, but I suppose I've really noticed it since, well..." She shrugged her shoulders before continuing. "Since I left the gang." The girl shook her head. "I've got used to it, but thank you," she replied. "I wish I didn't just go quiet, hoping they got bored. But I can't help it." Ace gave her a sympathetic smile. I get it, I really do. I suppose it's people like him as to why I haven't really come to terms with who I am. You're more courageous than me. I respect you immensely." She reached out, gently brushing her hand against the girl's arm, her smile growing all the more genuine with her words. The doctor listened to her carefully, taking in every word she was saying. He knew that 20th century Earth was still very backwards in its acceptance and tolerance of those who identified as anything other than cisgender and heterosexual, but he supposed he had never clocked just how far they still had yet to come. He recalled the boy, Midge, from their previous encounter with the Master, yet somehow he had not clocked that some of Ace's own reluctance to open up had come as a result of those she had been surrounded by growing up. He stood up straight, and his lips quivered upward as he gave her a smile. "I wonder if you would like to see the future?" he asked, once she had finished telling her story. She looked at him, curiously, her brow furrowing slightly. "The future? Yes," he mused. "Your time is just the start of tolerance breaking through, but the next few decades, the next century, so many people like you feel so much safer and happier to accept who they are." Ace thought for a moment. "If you're on about pride, I know about that," she replied. "That, yes, but there's more," he said, as he stood from his chair, dropping the base of his umbrella down against the TARDIS floor, the sound reverberating off the walls, as he turned back to face her. Legislation has meant that it's legal and widely accepted to embrace your differences, get married even. Would you like to see that kind of world? He extended a hand out, offering for her to stay close to him. Ace looked for his smile, to his outstretched hand, considering his offer, though upon realizing that there wasn't really any keeping her from saying yes, she placed her hand in his, and moved to stand beside him. The doctor's smile grew into a grin as he moved back towards the controls, plotting their destination. All Ace could do was stand and watch, curious of what he was typing in, where the TARDIS would be taking them. The familiar thrumming sound that reverberated around the control room signaled that they had landed. Ace reached towards the hat stand, grabbing and pulling on her flight jacket. She turned back to the doctor. "So, where are we?" she asked, curiously. "The year 2023, he replied, his hand reaching for the red lever for the doors. "London Hyde Park." He paused, pulling the lever as the white, roundel-adorned doors swung open. Ace watched the mechanism, then looked back towards the doctor. "Pride?" she asked, and he just nodded. She couldn't help but smile, watching as he led the way out, looking behind him to make sure she was following, which she did. Now, she was a 20th century girl, the 1980s, but this was the 21st, 40 years on from where she came from. All around her were people, so many people. She noticed all kinds of flags tied around people's necks, like capes, as they flowed behind them in the wind. The rainbows and the music was something she had grown used to seeing from the 80s, but this was a whole other level. "It's all so different. Bigger," she breathed, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. "I mean, Pride happened back then, but not like this." The doctor had moved to one side, watching her as she took in her surroundings. "There's still a lot to accomplish, even by these times, but people are free to embrace their differences and take pride in them," he explained. "By your time, the liberation movement had only just climbed from its embers, but now, I mean..." He paused as he leaped forward, taking her hand as he did so, rushing her towards the main parade. "Now they're celebrating 50 years since the first Pride celebrations in this country. New generations taking part and showing that difference is not something to be ashamed of." The crowds were loud, cheering, and their smiles matched the volume. Ace couldn't help but be thankful to the doctor for showing her. "Thank you, Professor," she muttered, leaning her head gently against his shoulder as he started to usher them both further into the crowds. The parade was in full swing, and the colors and music took her off guard, making her truly appreciate the progress since the Pride she had started to recognize back in her own time. Ace moved forward, a little further away from the doctor, swept forwards into the crowds. She made a glance behind her to make sure she knew where the doctor was, mainly to ensure they wouldn't get lost or separated. This wasn't her time. "Don't worry, Ace," she heard his voice, almost as if he could sense her thoughts. He probably could. "I'm only here, right behind you." She murmured a small note of gratitude before looking forward again. When she did, she noticed a face that was familiar. Older, but recognizable from school in Perryville. "Chantel?" she called out as she pushed her way through the crowds towards the woman before her. The woman turned at the sound of her name, frowning a little when she noticed a young teen was approaching her. "Hello?" she asked. "Sorry, do I know—" She stopped, recognizing Ace's face and the jacket, the same jacket from all those years ago. The girl who had related to her as a kid. The expression was now clear in her face. "Ace?" she asked, correcting her initial question. "It's not possible. How?" "Afraid it is," Ace replied. "It is you, isn't it? From Perryville?" "Yeah, it's me. But how—" She could have asked. "How is this possible? How come you haven't aged since '84? How did you find me in these crowds?" And the question would have been valid. Ace smiled. "I know. Well, it's complicated and a little mad, but I totally got a space alien friend with a time machine," she said, lightheartedly, before turning behind her. "Hey, Professor!" To Chantel's shock, an older man came towards them, a question-mark-handled umbrella held in his hand, used as a walking stick, and wearing the most garish sweater vest she had ever seen. "Everything all right?" he asked Ace, his accent of thick Scottish. Ace smiled and nodded towards Chantel. "This is Chantel, the girl I told you about," she explained. For a moment, Chantel was scared, but then the man held out his hand, his lips rising into a wide smile before saying, "Nice to meet you. I'm the doctor." "He's a friend, and the reason I haven't changed since school, from your perspective," Ace explained. "But I'm more surprised to bump into you. How are you with everything?" "Everything?" That was a big question, she thought. Chantel smiled, though. "Well," she took a deep breath. "Being gay isn't a crime anymore, and pride is more, well, proud now. I take it you're still in the 80s, but hey, I promise, it gets better. It just took a while. Takes a while? Oh, you're a confusing one, Ace McShane. Chantel sighed, slamming her palm into her forehead. Ace chuckled. It's a shame it took so long, Ace replied. Yeah, and we're still not in a perfect world, but it is so much better now than then, she said with a sort of shrug that said, I'm not called a slur anymore. I've learned not to take how far we've come for granted, but having said that, we're still fighting. Pride is a protest, after all, not a celebration. Ace smiled, stepping forward to give Chantel a big hug. The girl was surprised by her action, but welcomed it, placing her hands firmly against Ace's back, holding her gently. Ace clung on, as if she was gripping onto a future that she would have to wait nearly 40 years for, a future that Chantel had waited 40 years for. I'm so pleased that you've more pride in yourself. I remember that day in school, when we met, Ace muttered. It was tough to be like us then, wasn't it? The slurs, the name-calling, everything they said about AIDS. Chantel nodded, sadly. But things got better. I've had romances, been happy, and I'm in a good place. Time... She stared into the distance, the colored flags wafting in front of her vision. She smiled then, glancing back at Ace, and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Come on, I'll show you what you've been missing. Ace found herself glancing backwards towards the doctor, but he simply smiled. We're here for you, and we can stay as long as you would like, he said, with a nod. Go on. He chuckled. Ace gave him a one-armed hug, squeezed, and then ran off with Chantel, further into the crowds. Once she and the doctor returned to the TARDIS, later in the evening, Ace realized that her horizons had broadened. While she had no intention at this stage to leave the adventures she had with the doctor, she still knew that on the day she would decide to return to her own time in the 1980s, she would continue forth in the knowledge that the lives of people like her would get easier, no matter how long it took. The time rotor ascended and descended, signaling how far they were now in flight. She watched as the doctor, now without his jacket, which was hung neatly on the hat stand by the interior doors, was busy at the console once again. She smiled as she approached him, gently nudging against his shoulder. Thank you, was all she said. The doctor glanced towards her, letting his ordinarily strict frown soften into a smile that much matched her own. I'm glad I could be of service, Ace, he replied, and I hope you got everything you wanted out of the day. Ace nodded. I did. I really did, she said, as she gripped onto the side of the TARDIS console, and gently nodded towards the controls, signaling to the doctor. He nodded in return, keying in their destination. Onwards.